Thank you very much for coming here today. I would like to also thank the organizers for inviting me to talk about immigration. As you know, this is a very contentious issue, and with the elections coming up, this is a very timely moment to actually talk about immigration and to clarify some of the issues that we're facing. My talk is going to focus on Latin American migration to the US, but more broadly, it's going to discuss issues of immigration more generally, because we need to put in, Latin American migration in context to better precise the issues that we're facing today. The US has an ambivalent relation with the issue of immigration. On the one hand, the US defines itself as a nation of immigrants, but on the other hand, we recurrently face anti-immigrant movements, and immigrants are recurrently perceived as a threat or a challenge to the country. Just to put this in context, these are the trends in the percent foreign-born across decades going back to 1850. So as you all know, immigration was very high at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. Then declined. It was the lowest in the 1960s, 1970s, and then it began to increase again, especially in the 1980s. Today, around 13% of the US population is foreign-born. We're still below the highest point at the turn of the century and the end of the 19th century. But what's important to know here is that one way or another, this graph presents different visions of what the US is. What is the normal period for the US in terms of population composition? Is it what we saw at the turn of the century, percent foreign-born, 15%? Is it what we're seeing today, 13%? Or is it the 5% that we see in the 1960s? In discussions today about what we want to be, what kind of identity we want to have, how we define ourselves, depending on where you pick, you tell different stories about the US. In the going back to what we really are, which period are we picking? Are we picking the 1960s, or are we picking the turn of the century? And in addition, if you go back to the experience of the turn, to the historical experience, and you think that maybe we can learn something about that period, you can see that this was a period of immigration that spanned the 1850s to the 1930s, 1940s, pretty much 80, 90 years of immigration. Are we at the beginning of a period long like that, or this is something that's going to end? Are we going to stop it? This was produced by different waves of immigrants coming at different periods in time. This was mainly produced by Latin American immigration to the US. But is Latin American immigration to the US the one that's going to continue into the future? Can we learn something from that? And those are the difficult questions that we face in discussions about immigration and in the political discussion about immigration. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about Latin American migration today. I also would like to highlight that this is not just a US phenomenon. If it was the US at the beginning of the century who was really receiving immigrants, today the issue of immigration and how we deal with immigrants is an issue that crosses pretty much all developed societies. This is Great Britain, this is Canada, who has immigration close to 25%. Are we going to approach that? Are we going to stabilize at this level? Australia, which has much higher levels of immigration. So this is an issue that's not just a US phenomenon. This is not that just the US is receiving immigrants. This is a pattern that in many ways defines developed societies. Something that is key for understanding the discussion about immigration today is that if at the beginning of the century it was mainly European immigrants coming to the US, since the 1960s and especially in the 1980s, it's mainly from Latin America and Asia. Is this going to change? Is it going to remain like that? Is a composition? Is this a particular challenge? Is it better if they're coming from Europe or they're coming from Latin America? Those are the political discussions that we're facing. In this change, a big player has been Mexico. Mexican migration to the US has been the largest sustained flow of immigrants starting in the 1960s, but especially in the 1980s and 1990s. Between 1980 and today, close to 8 million migrants from Mexico enter the US. They represent 30% of all of the immigrant population. Is it going to continue? The data for 2010 shows that in many ways this has probably reached a limit. Now there's some, depending on some estimates, there might be some evidence that Mexican migration to the US has stopped. And in many ways, the foreign-born Mexican population in the US might be declining. What does this tell you? Tell us about what kind of discussions we need to be having when it comes to immigration and Mexico. Another important issue to remember in this change is that the Latino population until the 1980s was highly concentrated in just a few states, primarily in the Southwest, where it was primarily Mexican, some pockets in Florida, it was Cuban, in the Northeast, Puerto Rican, and some pockets of Mexican population in the Midwest. But it was very much a local problem. It was a local phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of some specific area, of some specific states. And since the 1980s, the Latino population has been spreading all across the U.S. And pretty much now every single area in the U.S. has been touched by Latinos, by immigrants, and this has made immigration and Latinos and the change in demographic composition of the U.S. a national phenomenon. What implications does this have for the elections, for voting patterns, for the divisions between Democrats and Republicans? This is increasingly a national problem, and that's why it's so important. That's why import is so prevalent today in the discussion around the elections. So what are the issues that we're facing? Why is it that immigrants come to the U.S. and go to developed societies? This is very much rooted in very powerful social, historical, economic, and demographic forces. Fertility has been declining in rich societies. Aging of the population is a very real phenomenon. At the same time, we have been experiencing a very rapid economic growth, especially during the 1990s and 2000s. So there has been a consistent increased demand for labor that primarily has been satisfied by immigrant labor. If you look at the change in the labor force between 1995 and 2000, almost 46% of the new jobs created in the US were taken by immigrants. This was even higher in 2005. Basically, without immigrant labor, those jobs would not be here. It has declined after the recession by overall flows in immigration, and the growth of the immigrant population is very closely tied to the demand for labor in rich countries, and it's something that if the US goes back to experiencing very rapid economic growth, job creation, and so forth, it's something that we can expect is not going to go away. So this is a reality that we need to face. Where do they work, immigrants? What kind of industries? A lot are concentrated in low-skilled industries, which is here private household, housekeeping, and so forth. But if you think about it, we are increasingly becoming a professional society. There's increasing demand for services, low-skilled services. The growth in low-skilled occupations is closely tied to the growth of high-skilled occupations, and there's a growing division of labor. So these, even though they occupy these positions, it has allowed other groups, particularly women, to move up to better employment and better positions. So this is not separated from the growth in good employment. Accommodations, the hotel industry, warehousing, but you also see them overrepresented in management and administration. They still continue to be very important in agriculture, which is an industry that we protect in the U.S. Food services, you've seen them. Construction, again, we develop and new areas of destination emerge. The movement of internal population towards the south, demand for housing and construction attracts immigrants. They're less represented in public administration, education, the areas where language becomes more like a need, and there are different forms of arrangement. They tend to be underrepresented there. But for these industries, the immigrant labor force has been key in maintaining it and providing them with a sustainable workforce. Do they compete with natives? This is an issue that always appears in discussions about immigration. Let me just stress that immigration has coincided with record low unemployment levels in the US. So overall, there's no evidence that immigrants take jobs from natives, because the basic evidence is that when immigrants were growing in the US, unemployment was at record low. In fact, they come to the US because there are jobs, otherwise they would not come to the US. The discussion tends to be more about wages, really. Are they pushing the wages of natives down or not? But there are some very strong, powerful forces that are affecting the demand and the impact that immigrants are having on the US. We are increasingly becoming a highly educated society. Among young cohorts, the proportion not completing high school is very low. Increasingly, the US population is achieving a college education. That's good news, and that's the idea of growth, economic mobility, and social mobility. So the main growth, this is the change in the labor force by education. The main growth of the native population has been the college graduates, followed by those with some college. The native labor force with just high school education has been declining, and those with less than high school education has been declining even more. It's very rare in the US today to be in that category. That's the category where the foreign-born population has actually been replenishing the labor force in the less than high school education or high school education. There is some effect among the highly educated, but it's really among the low ranks of the labor force where immigrants have been participating. This gives you a new perspective in terms of who are they competing with. They're really competing with those at the bottom of educational stratification in the US, which is a very small population. And the less than high school population in the US, which is the one that probably has been most affected by immigration, is actually a very small portion of the US labor market today, especially among young generations. And so still, we have jobs that we are creating where they're not suitable for college graduates, and where we still need a labor force to perform those jobs. And it's a lot of the immigration is concentrated, especially from Mexico, is concentrated among that group. The foreign-born Mexican population in the US today has on average 7 years of education. And so in terms of competing with the native population, they only compete with population with that level of education, which is not the US today. Now, the way these immigrants have been arriving to the US, especially from Latin America and Mexico, is undocumented. Today, 50% of the Mexican-born population in the US is undocumented. It's something that affects not just Mexicans, not just Latinos, it pretty much affects all immigrant groups. 1 in 3 immigrants is undocumented. And if we have any immigrants in the room, you probably know that the lines between being documented or being undocumented is actually very thin in the US. And so this is a problem not just of those who are undocumented, but of all immigrants. And it's something that we need to address. Immigrants change statuses until they become legal permanent residents, but it's something that's defining immigration today, and it's affecting the labor market, the immigrant experience, and the impact that they have. We have a lot of discussions about whether immigrants push wages down. However, we cannot really tell if they push wages down just as a supply effect of having a larger labor force, or because they are undocumented. Being undocumented pushes them to the underground economy. They suffer exploitation. They suffer all sorts of abuses from employers. They don't get paid, and a lot of that is not just for being an immigrant, but it's closely connected to being undocumented. So it's an issue that I'm going to come back to that. Why is it? What are the origins in the U.S. of the undocumented population? Undocumented status is basically a legal definition. It's something that's really defined by our legal system. We have a group of people who are working in the U.S., but legally they're being defined as undocumented. The origins actually can be traced back to our changes in immigration legislation. Particular is sort of like an unintended consequence of the 1965 immigration reform, which is pretty much what's guiding our immigration legislation even today. At that time, Mexico and the U.S., you might know this, I'm going to be very brief here, there was what was called the Bracero program. There was a temporary workers program where Mexican workers were recruited in Mexico to work in agriculture, and it was temporary workers program. People were going back and forth, and it was providing the labor force mainly for agriculture. It was considered, this is the time of the civil rights movement. It was considered an exploitative system. It suffered all sorts of abuses. Workers didn't get paid, etc. So at that time, the Bracero program was eliminated, and Mexico was included in the immigration reform, and quotas were applied to Mexico the same way as they were applied to all other Western Hemisphere countries. So from having a large Bracero program that was attracting 400,000 workers every year, more or less, and it went down to having Mexico having only 10,000 numbers of visas. So what happened is that immigration did not stop. Well, before 1965, Mexican immigrants were entering the U.S. as temporary migrants. 1965 stopped the Bracero program, so the temporary migrants went down in decline, but it switched from being temporary migrants to becoming undocumented immigrants. So the origins of the undocumented population, it's actually an unintended consequence of our immigration legislation. This is, again, something that immigration, for the most part, is an economic phenomenon that responds to economic forces. The changes in legislation affected that flow, and what happened is that they changed status, but not the dynamic of migration. In addition, we passed a lot of border enforcement pieces of legislation that has, over time, turned what was a very fluid movement of population between Mexico and the U.S., with people coming back and forth according to fluctuations in economic conditions, into an actual border, into an actual very rigid border, close to a wall, even though we want to, not a complete wall, very close to a wall. This has made it very difficult for people to go back and forth. So it didn't really stop those coming into the country, but it really reduced the likelihood of people going back to Mexico. And so not only we changed their status and they became undocumented, but also they settle and they're more likely to stay in the U.S., and they're sort of trapped in the U.S. because we made it very difficult for them to return. So that's the context of discussions that we're facing when it comes to Latino migration to the US. But what are the new changes in the flow? It's at the peak of immigration, around 400,000 Mexicans were entering the US every year, pretty much. These are all not very precise numbers because we don't really have a good estimate of the flow of immigrants. And, but it was around 400,000. This was at the peak, the highest level of immigration. One measure of the flow is the border apprehensions. These are people that get caught at the border trying to enter the US, and then they get detained at the border, and then they get sent back, and they never make it into the US. Most of the time, they try it again until they enter. That's the way it used to be. So it has been regarded as a measure of the flow. How many people are trying to enter the US? Are they really trying to enter the US? This is what's been happening over time. This was at the peak of immigration during Bill Clinton. The border apprehension was at the highest level. It declined. Here, this is the 2001 recession. It went back up, and then it has been consistently declining until today, which is at record low levels. In many ways, if you one interpretation of this data is that Mexicans are really not trying to enter the US anymore. So the discussion about needing to build a wall between Mexico and the US might be outdated because whatever that might apply at this point in time. But today, for practical purposes, they might not be trying to enter the US anymore. In fact, according to some estimates, net migration from Mexico to the US today might be negative. We have more people returning to Mexico than actually coming to the US. Are we going to make this a policy issue that's going to drive the elections? There's other sources of data that shows that the significance of Mexico might have been declining. Foreign-born population from Mexico was 30% in 2000, declined to 29% in 2010, and but there are the group, other group has grown, which is the Central American population, and now the Latino population, the Latin American immigrant population in the US. There's a higher Central American component. Other evidence that suggests that maybe the migration from Latin America to the US might have slowed down, and the massive immigration that we saw before might not continue to happen in the future. Overall, there has been a decline of immigrants arriving in the US. This is the number of the percent of the immigrant population that arrived 5 years prior to the census. It was very high in 1990, in 2000, it declined by 2010. So there's evidence that less people are coming to the US. When we look at how it varies by country of origin, the most of the decline is from Mexico. It has declined dramatically between 2000 and 2010. Other countries, it has grown. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and there's other. China is increasingly sending immigrants to the US, India, Philippines, Vietnam, and Africa. Again, if we go back to the European experience and the history of immigration, even though the US had, at the turn of the century, had a period of 80, 90 years of immigration, it was not always the same group. The English first, Germans, Irish, Italian, Eastern Europeans. So are we facing that same reality here? How do we deal with a process that might very likely change in its origin and its characteristics? Another dimension that is affecting this, has affected this, is the number of deportations. And again, this is something which is a policy discussion. What are we going to do with the undocumented population? These are the trends in the number of deportations of Mexicans and overall. Mexicans, by far the largest group of people are being deported today in the US. There was always a certain number of deportations going back to 1990s. These were pretty much criminal immigrants. We have always been deporting criminals, and if you want to take an estimate about the number of criminals among immigrants is something around the number that you see here. 1996, immigration reform, it increased the number of deportations. This is during Bill Clinton. It actually declined the first year of George W. Bush, where we were talking about further integration with Mexico, common market formation, and so forth. It actually declined. 9/11 happened, and they increased dramatically after that. And today, we are deporting 400,000 immigrants every year. Just to give you a sense of the volume, that was the number of Mexicans entering the U.S. at the peak of immigration flow. So the coupled with voluntary returns, it's not unreasonable to think that the foreign-born Mexican population in the U.S. might actually be declining. And since Obama, we have deported 1.6 million immigrants. According to the Department of Homeland Security, each deportation costs around $26,000, $30,000. We are estimating that we have 10 million undocumented immigrants. Are we going to spend the money deporting them? What kind of policy decisions are we making? How are we going to address the issue? This has created a problem or an issue for Mexico. Mexico is increasingly facing the problem of return migrants. Return migrants was always a factor in Mexican migration to the U.S., but they were very successful. These are their incomes. They were making more money than the non-migrant population. Today, the return migrants are actually making less money in Mexico than the non-migrants. This is an issue for Mexico that Mexico is facing. For the U.S., the only way you can produce a deportable alien is by criminalizing immigration. And we have increasingly been criminalizing immigration. And this has been a burden on the federal justice system. Increasingly, unlawful re-entry is a main offense in the federal justice system. Immigration has gone from just 5% of all the offenses in 1992 to 30%. In addition, as a deterrent towards re-entry, we have enforced prison sentences. Unlawful re-entry, if somebody gets caught that was deported and then re-enters the U.S., now there's a mandatory 24-month prison sentence. And you've seen the estimates of how much the prison system costs in the U.S. So add up all these numbers and think about, in economic sense, whether this makes sense or not. So that's the context. So what are the policy decisions that we're facing, and you see them in the discussion in the political campaigns? What are we going to do with the undocumented population? And this is something that is a reality that we have to face. At the end of the day, there are only two options, really. We either legalize them or we deport them. There's many different ways of how we can legalize the population. We can have very detailed discussions about how you want to legalize the population. You can even discuss about who gets papers, who doesn't. Are they going to pay taxes, pay back taxes? What kind of expectations? How expensive are we going to make it? You can have a lot of discussion about the conditions that you can require from immigrants who enter the U.S. without paper, who worked in the U.S. all these years, what to expect from them. But you have to agree that you're going to give them papers, that the end result is going to give papers. And I don't think we are there. For a lot of, unless you get to the conclusion that you have to come up with a solution that will give people papers, you cannot discuss the details. If you believe that deportations are the solution, then there's no discussion about this. And at the end of the day, we cannot resolve this issue. And you can call it amnesty, you can call it whatever you want, you can even, but unless we agree on this very first distinction, we cannot move forward. And I think that that's a key decision. Just to remind you, the last amnesty was in 1986. So it has been a very long time. And we cannot expect that the system that was established in 1965 with very minor modifications since then did not produce some distortions in who gets paper, who doesn't get paper. We need to come to terms that the reality of immigration was different from what was anticipated. So, in fact, good immigration systems, we are continuously revise the legislation, adapt to the new realities, because immigration is a continuously changing phenomenon. They come from different countries, different blah, 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 and we cannot expect that we can have a system that can last all those years and not need modifications. So, but it's a political decision. At the end of the day, these are all political decisions. Deportations have many consequences. It creates tensions between the federal and local levels. It affects families, businesses, and local areas. This is not something that's just affecting immigrants. Most of these immigrants have children in the U.S. who are U.S. citizens, and it's not just the immigrants themselves that are being affected. They are children who are U.S. citizens. And so what kind of solution are we going to have for that situation? There are other many concrete policy decisions that are being decided in this election. Future of deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA. This is something that directly affects universities and that directly affects Penn and all institutions of higher education. This is a provision in 2012 that allowed the children who came to the U.S. with their parents when they were children to actually attend higher education, and after they complete college, they get a work permit that gets renewed every year, and it allows them to work. Currently, we have 700,000 children in that situation. This needs to get renewed because this did not go through Congress. What's the future of these children is going to be affected by the outcome of this election. Similarly, the future of deferred action for parents of Americans, this is an executive order to allow the parents of children born in the U.S. who are U.S. citizens to actually stay in the U.S. And again, what's the alternative? Are we going to send the parents back? What about the children? They are U.S. citizens. Do they have rights? Do they don't have rights? Many of the returned migrants from the U.S. to Mexico are actually U.S. citizens because these are children born in the U.S. that actually went back to Mexico. So the idea that we have very clear distinctions between an undocumented and a legal resident, when you start thinking about families, is not so clear. And the families have both legal residents and undocumented residents. How do we address that issue? A further issue that connects more broadly with discussions about immigration has to do with the skilled workers and H1B visas. I showed you the trends of immigration and qualifications of the labor force. The U.S. has benefited from attracting high-skilled workers. And there's when you look at immigrant groups, you always have, they tend to be polarized. You have people within the group, people with relatively low levels of education, and people with very high levels of education. Latinos includes very low levels of education, and includes people like me with high levels of education. So this is a contentious issue, and you've seen the discussion about H1B visas that's closely tied to discussions about free trade and integration. This is a proposal. This is a very controversial policy. You might have followed that, but there's a proposal to attract entrepreneurs. This is something that the U.S. has always benefited from, and are we going to continue that or not? Finally, I want to say something about refugees. This also touches on Latin American migration to the US. You might have seen the news about Honduran children trying to enter the US, or Hondurans escaping violence, or Central Americans escaping violence and requesting to be treated as refugees. Refugees is a peculiar kind of immigrant. It's somebody where the receiving country recognizes that they have the right to immigrate because they're being persecuted, they're escaping violence. It's controversial when it comes to the issue of Syrian refugees in the US, with many states refusing to accept Syrian refugees, but it's also an issue that's affecting Latin American migration. Are we going to recognize this as a separate category? It's increasingly one of the main motivators for migration, political disruptions and violence. Are we going to accommodate them? How are we going to face that reality? So just very briefly, some conclusions in terms of Latin American migration to the US. We cannot expect that the patterns observed in the recent past to continue into the future. It could be that it's a good time to address immigration reform and legalization, given that the flow of immigrants might have stopped. So maybe, if you want to be positive, this opened the doors to actually discuss the issue of the undocumented population and how we regulate labor recruitment or the flow of immigrants. The immigration regulation continues to be guided by 1965. We need to update and correct its provisions so that we reflect the new reality of immigration. And undocumented and refugees are two pressing issues that we definitely need to address. Okay, so thank you very much.
Your figures seem to show an increase in the criminalization activity related to immigration, and also an overall decline in immigration. Is it fair to assume that those two are very much related, or do you think they're independent factors that are working?
The issue of the growth in the criminal status of immigrants and the fact that they are increasingly represented among criminal offenders is again closely connected with changes in how we define criminal activities. We increasingly, it used to be that states, for instance, would provide immigrants with driver's license irrespective of immigration status. But then we changed the policy, and so undocumented workers cannot get driver's license. Obviously, they kept driving. And so now they were driving without a license. And that opens the door to appearing in the criminal justice system. Something happened which was very negative for immigrants with 9/11. And since 9/11, immigration has increasingly been constructed not as a part of the labor process, not as a labor market phenomenon, but tied to immigration. The immigration, all the immigration-related activities were moved to the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration, Customs and Enforcement Agency, and so 9/11 have produced a decoupling of immigration from some economic phenomenon to a security issue. And in that decoupling, we're increasingly presenting and constructing immigrants as criminals. Of course, you're going to find criminal aliens, you're going to find drug dealers, but it's not the defining characteristic of immigration. But we cannot produce that decoupling. And we cannot separate the discussion of immigration from the discussion of security, and which has been very negative, I would argue, for immigrants.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that struck me in your presentation was the fact that return migrants form an increasing problem for Mexico because they have lower incomes than the average in Mexico. Knowing your previous work from the 90s on remittances and savings from Mexican migrants in the US, which are spent on consumption and therefore increase actually the development in Mexico, would you argue that those conclusions, like from the 90s, still hold in the current situation?
Thank you for reading. I actually have a recent paper investigating exactly that issue. It used to be that return migration, if you ignore the fact that people are crossing a border, and you think about migration in terms of population mobility, migration has always been a challenge for social mobility. You can go back to pretty much, I can assume that everybody's history here, at some point, you move for a better job, for better wages, for better employment. So you might have crossed state lines, but it's legal. But international migration, still today, is motivated by the search of social mobility. And social mobility, in many instances, means for Mexicans, it meant coming to the U.S., accumulating enough money, and then going back to Mexico and opening a business. And so the social mobility was not always in the U.S., was actually in Mexico. So for the longest time, the return migrants were successful entrepreneurs in Mexico. They would go back to Mexico and buy a house, buy a tractor for their and invest their remittances, and it was a form of investment. That was when return migration was voluntary. It was so people would come to the U.S., stay in the U.S. as long as they wanted, and accumulate enough capital to go back and be successful. What has happened with deportations and with the economic recession is that people are going back before reaching the level of accumulation, of capital accumulation, experience, and so forth, that will allow them to be successful in Mexico. So now Mexico is facing that problem that if before the return migrants were investing and promoting economic development in Mexico, now they're being increasingly incorporated in the informal sector and receiving lower wages. If you look at the data, you still have successful migrants. You still have migrants who are returning to Mexico with investments and so forth, but there's increasing proportion of migrants who are returning before they can be successful in Mexico. And so that's a problem that Mexico is facing. Some people tie that to crime in Mexico and to some of the problems that Mexico, at the same time, another issue that's affecting this is Mexico has experienced dramatic declines in fertility levels. Mexico City, the total fertility rate is 1.6. So Mexico City is going to be attracting internal migrants, and if people are in some of these communities are deciding whether to come to the U.S. or go to Mexico City, one possibility is that increasingly going to go to Mexico City. So there's a lot of good news on the Mexican side in terms of slowing down the flow of immigrants, but there are some realities that are facing that they're going back, and in some cases the impact is even more pronounced than the impact that they have in the U.S. when they're coming here. But definitely, yeah.
seems like some of the mythology behind immigration, or at least the earlier immigration, was that everybody was looking for streets paved with gold and all that. And they were going to start at the bottom and they were going to shoot straight up. But it seems like the immigration that you're talking about that's going on now, it seems like people are just coming, escaping something, trying to get by. And it seems like what's being left out of it is that they do, I would imagine if I'm leaving a country, I'm also thinking that this next country is not only going to just get me by, but I'm going to be able to get to the pinnacle of that society too. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I think there are two parts to your question. The first one is, unfortunately, we have reconstructed the European experience of immigration as this, fantastic, easy transition where people were coming to the US and they were easily incorporated and they became very successful, that they wanted to come to the US and learn the language, and 40% of European immigrants actually went back to Europe, and many of them never learned the language. And if you look at the statistical data, the differences between the native-born population and immigrant population, it took 100 years for those differences to disappear between Europeans and US natives. It was not an immediate thing. It took 100 years. Latin American immigrants are just getting to the US. It's just the beginning. If you compare Latin American immigrants to European immigrants at the same point in their migration trajectories, actually Latin American immigrants are doing better. The learning English is actually much faster among Latinos than what it was among Europeans. And some of you might, if you have German origins, you might know how Germans resisted actually language assimilation. And these were also countries that they brought unions, they brought the labor movement. You've seen the movies of the mafia. It was so, but for some reason we reconstructed this image of the European experience as an easy transition, which is hurting how we see the new wave of immigration. So it's always good to remind ourselves that it was not easy then, and that whatever anxieties were in the 1920s, they actually sort of disappeared. That things are, that immigrants move up and they incorporate, they change the US, but in a positive way. And some of the anxieties we're facing today, if you go back to the 1920s, they're actually very similar. And they were unnecessary in the 1920s, and they seem sort of unnecessary today. And the other issue is that, you mentioned the perception among immigrants that it's easy to come to the US and be successful in the US. And that in part connects with the image that the US portrays to the world. The land of opportunity, you can make it in the US, and we sell that image to in developing countries, and then people buy into, and when they come to the US, they find out that it's not so straightforward. And so we might want to think about, how we present ourselves, how we define ourselves.
My question deals with how much economic importance is there to the Mexicans who come here and get a job and send money back to Mexico? I understood that was a great benefit to the Mexican government. Does it continue, and how relevant is it to the costs we would have of deporting them or something?
Yeah, it fluctuates, and sending money back home is still the main reason for migration, which is something where we can learn in terms of how we want to affect the flow. People are still coming to the US with the image that they're going to come here in 2 years and accumulate all money and then go back. And they come here, and so they take any jobs because the objective is to accumulate and remit. That's why the jobs they take are not, it's not easy to replace them with natives, because natives don't have that attitude, because they're looking more forward-looking. If you're a U.S.-born person, you're looking for a career, not just a short-term job that's going to allow you to send money back home. Now, the more broadly, I think it would be important to learn from that and connect our discussion of immigration with broader discussions about economic policies. The reality is that there are no capital markets in Mexico. So to buy a house in Mexico, even today, in the U.S. we're used to getting a loan in 30 years and paying like that. But in Mexico, capital markets are underdeveloped. And so if people are still coming to the U.S. to accumulate capital, and if you want to reduce the push factors that make people come to the U.S., you might want to think about how to integrate capital markets and to reduce that push. And it is something, the promoting economic integration and promoting some level of development in Mexico might actually help reduce immigration towards the U.S. The European experience now is difficult to make references to, but the European experience, when the European Union and what to do with Spain, Italy, Greece, and so forth, these were things that were discussed in terms of the context of integration. At some point, it seemed like we were going to be discussing more integration between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, but now that's not even close to being done. In fact, which is not positive to have for having a more rational and beneficial for everybody discussions of these issues. But they're still coming to remit, and it's still a major motivation. If you can affect that, you reduce a lot of the motivation to come to the U.S. Yeah.
Might be a bit tangential, but labels, the dominant society have often given labels to minorities.
Yeah.
Take American Indian, for example, who are not Indians and may not want to refer themselves as Americans. Do you see any motion towards redefining Latinos, since they're actually not Latin?
Well, I always tell in class that there are no Latinos in Latin America, and so, and definitely Latinos is a category that exists in the U.S. and it's connected to how the U.S. Perceives the group, and Latin America is called Latin America because of basically the origins is French imperialism. And so Hispanics is not good because it comes from Spain. Latin America is not exactly. And but the issue with Latinos and labels is Latinos are in some ways different from other labels in that it includes people of different races, different countries, different histories of immigration. And so on the one hand, Latinos, as they can drop the Latino identity. And so you have the successful Latino that forgets about the Latino background, then becomes white. So there's a lot of potential for a portion of Latinos to actually become white. But there's also the potential for Latinos to actually blur these very rigid racial distinctions. And so you have people, members of Latinos, who are of African origin, of indigenous origin, of European origins, and they're all Latinos. and they find a common identity in being Latino. So there is some argument out there that Latino as a category is different from previous one because it can transform the U.S. tendency to construct very rigid categories. And so I think that would be very beneficial for the U.S. if we blur the racial and ethnic lines, and if Latinos can do that, it would be very beneficial. But or we might end up constructing a new, more rigid categories. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
for
for
coming.
coming.